All right, let's discuss about the second process in procurement plan, that's conduct procurement. Before we get into the concept, let's understand two basic terms, payments and incentives. If you're already familiar about it, feel free to skip. First, payments. Payment is the money that's paid to the seller. It may get paid as the work progresses, or according to the payment schedule, or upon completion of certain phases, or upon completion of the project. The project manager must know when payments to be made. It's the project manager's responsibility to ensure that the fund is available to make the payment as per the plan. Let's talk about the incentives. The buyer's focus will be on total cost, performance, schedule, or the combination of these, whereas the seller usually focused on the profits to be made from the project. Incentives are used to bring the buyer's objectives in line with the seller's. The buyer will provide an additional fee if the seller meets certain schedule, cost, or other project performance. It's designed to motivate the seller's effort towards the benefit of the project. I'm sure you already related this with the incentive that are in place in your organization or in your team. The conduct procurement is the process of obtaining seller's responses, selecting a seller, and awarding a contract. The key benefit of this process is that it selects a qualified seller and implement the legal agreement for delivery. The end results of this process are established agreements including formal contract. This process is performed periodically throughout the project as needed. Let's discuss about contract types. Fixed price. First, the concept. As the name implies, the price for the contract is fixed for the defined scope. For the buyer, fixed price contract is a way to control cost. This type of contract works well when the statement of work is defined clearly along with the final product. If the costs are more than the agreed upon amount, then the seller must bear the additional cost. Therefore, the buyer has the least cost risk in this type of contract because the scope is well defined. As it's a fixed price contract, the seller's profit is not disclosed to the buyer. The seller is forced to accept a high level of risk. Generally, fixed price contract is not always the best choice, and in some cases, it may be even inappropriate, especially when SOW is not well defined. In case if the SOW is not sufficiently detailed, then it would lead to claims and disputes. In those cases, the seller will add a significant amount of reserve to the price to cover the risk. Therefore, the buyer ends up in paying more. When the SOW is not well written, the buyer will not be able to state with confidence whether something is within the scope or outside the scope. In those occasions, the seller easily tries to increase the profit by cutting the scope or claiming that the work the buyer wants is outside the contract and thus requires a change order. If the seller realizes that he will not be able to make profit from the project, then he will remove the best resource from the project and decrease the quality naturally. Let's look at the types of fixed price contracts. There are 5 types. First, purchase order. Second, firm fixed price. Third, fixed price incentive fee. Fourth one, fixed price with the economic price adjustments. And the fifth one is price award fee. Let's detail them one by one. Purchase order. A purchase order is the simplest type of fixed price contract. This type of contract is normally unilateral, meaning signed by one party instead of bilateral, which is signed by both parties. Purchase order becomes contract when the buyers accept the terms. The seller then performs or delivers according to the terms, for example, equipments or products. Although unilateral purchase orders are most common, some companies will require the seller's signature on a purchase order before the buyer will consider the purchase order is official. In that case, it's the signature that forms the acceptance needed to make a contract. For example, 30 kg of wood at $9 per kg. The next one is firm fixed price. The most common in fixed price contract is called firm fixed price contract. Here, for a well-defined scope, the price is fixed. For example, $50,000 will be paid on completion of the scope. Fixed price with economic price adjustment, FPEPA. This is quite similar to firm fixed price contract with a little tweak. Let's say you are the buyer and your huge construction projects will run for multiple years. For the construction, you decided to buy the concrete blocks from a supplier. To make concrete blocks, steel is one of the key input material. But the steel price can fluctuate depending on the supply versus demand, which is not in the control of vendor. So you can allow the vendor to change the cost of concrete block depending on the steel price. But remember, here you are allowing the vendor to increase the cost of concrete block pertaining to steel portion only. Steel is one of the key input, but not the only input for making concrete block. So the vendor can play around the cost that is pertaining to the steel alone, not for the entire concrete block. The next type is fixed price incentive fee, FPIF. Let's look at an example first, then you can understand it easily. The contract value is $100,000. An additional $5,000 will be paid if target is achieved within 5 weeks in advance. Here, as the name indicates, the seller gets incentive if the work gets done faster, cheaper, or better. The seller gets better profit by meeting specified performance criteria. A variation on fixed price incentive fee contract is fixed price incentive fee successive target contract. Don't worry, only the name is longer. In simple terms, in this type of contract, the contract for the incentive is changed after the first target is reached. Fixed price award fee, FPAF. Let's look at the example first to understand it easily. The total contract value is $100,000. The seller will get additional $5,000 if the performance exceeds by every 15%, but maximum allowed award is $10,000. In FPIF contract, the buyer pays a fixed plus an award fee, a bonus, based on the performance. This is similar to the fixed price incentive fee contract, except the total possible award amount is determined in advance based on performance. This is to ensure that the buyer don't overpay to the seller. In the above example, when the seller exceeds the performance by 15%, then he gets additional $5,000 for every 15%. He gets additional $5,000, but the maximum award is limited to $10,000, not beyond that. The next one is cost reimbursable contract. In cost reimbursable contract, the buyer will be paying to the vendor for the actual cost incurred to the work. Here, the buyer is at risk because the buyers don't have control over the final amount. He may get multiple invoices mentioning cost for this, cost for that, etc., etc. There are 5 types in it. The first one is cost contract. In cost contract, the seller gets paid on the actual cost that he spends to complete the work. There is no profit paid to him. He merely gets paid on the actual cost spent. You may be thinking, who will be ready to accept this kind of contract when there's no profit? Yes, as you guessed rightly, it's the non-profit organizations. This type of contract is typically used by non-profit organizations. There is no profit with this type of contract. The seller is reimbursed but does not make a profit. Contract equals cost for work including material. The next is cost plus fixed fee. Here, the seller gets paid back the actual cost incurred to complete the work plus a fee representing seller's profit. Let's say seller A spends $5,000 to develop a static website. So he gets paid that $5,000 for what he spent plus, let's say, $1,000 as his profit. The initial estimation for the project may be $3,000, but the actual cost may be $5,000. Even then, the seller gets paid that $5,000 and on top of it, $1,000 as profit. So you need to be careful in this type of contracts. A cost reimbursable contract is used when the exact scope of the work is uncertain. Therefore, cost cannot be estimated accurately enough to efficiently use a fixed price contract. This is also called as cost plus fixed fee contract because the seller gets paid on actual plus his profit. The next is cost plus incentive fee. The seller is reimbursed for performing the contract work on actuals and receives a predetermined incentive fee based on achieving certain performance objectives, such as if the project is delivered 5 weeks in advance, there will be an additional payment of $5,000. This incentive is defined in the contract itself. At times, the contract mentions about buyer-seller split as well. Let's say at the beginning, the seller comes with an estimate of $10,000, which is low. The buyer agreed for the estimate and the work gets completed. Upon completing the work, the seller comes back and says that the cost is $30,000, which is $20,000 more than the initial estimate. What to do in this situation? Here comes buyer-seller split for rescue. In this example, the buyer pays the initial estimate of $10,000 as agreed. For the remaining $20,000, the buyer and seller splits the cost. It can be 80-20 ratio. 80% the buyer's share and 20% is seller's share. So 80% of $20,000 is $16,000, which will be paid by the buyer, and the remaining 20% of $20,000, which is $4,000, the seller has to bear. So in total, the buyer paid the initial agreed estimate of $10,000 plus 80% of overshoot cost, which is $16,000. So in total, $26,000. Seller bears 20% of the share, which is $4,000. The next type is cost plus award fee. Here, the buyer pays the reimbursable cost, but for the award, he pays based on his level of satisfaction. The best example for this type of contract is you go to the restaurant, order the food that you like to eat. You pay for it, but you pay the tip to the waiter based on your satisfaction. It can be 5%, or it can be 10%, or it can be even 15% of the total check. It totally depends on your satisfaction. You may even pay nothing. Similarly, in this type of contract, the seller gets the award fee based on the buyer's satisfaction. It is judged subjectively. There can be negotiation before deciding the final amount. Example, reimbursable cost 5,000 plus award fee based on satisfaction. Now, the next type is cost plus fee, CPF, or also called as cost plus percentage of cost, CPPC. A CPF or CPPC contract requires the buyer to pay for all the cost plus a percentage of cost as a fee. Let's say a project costs $20,000. The buyer has to pay the whole $20,000 plus on top of it, he has to pay an agreed percentage of total cost as profit to the seller. It can be 20% or 30%, or it can be anything depending on the agreement between the buyer and the seller. Let's say 30% is what agreed. So the buyer has to pay project cost of $20,000 plus 30% of $20,000, which is $6,000 as profit to the seller. So in total, $26,000. I hope you can see the point that the seller gets full advantage from this type of contract. The seller will anyway get all the money as reimbursement that is spent for the project, and on top of it, a fixed percentage as profit. Let's say if the seller has to buy material, vendor A charges $10, where for the same material, vendor B charges $50. The seller will tend to buy from vendor B because as long as the total cost of the project goes higher and higher, his profit also will go higher. Obviously, the seller will try to increase the actual spending because of his profit percentage also gets increased. So, this type of cost reimbursable contract is generally not allowed in countries like in the United States for federal acquisition or procurement under federal acquisition regulations. It's totally bad for the buyers. The next type is time and material. In this type of contract, the buyer pays on a per hour or per item basis. Time and material contracts are frequently used for service efforts in which the level of effort cannot be defined when the contract is awarded. It has elements of fixed price contract in the fixed price per hour and a cost reimbursable contract in the material cost and the fact that the total cost is unknown. Normally, the terms and conditions are simple. For example, contract is for $100 per hour plus expenses of material at actual cost, or contract is for $100 per hour plus material at $5 per kg of wood. If you agree to pay based on the number of hours per person, do you think he will try to complete the work faster? Absolutely not. Because the more he shows as he's working, he gets paid for each hour. The focus will not be on efficiency or completing the task on time. So the buyer will be at benefit. For this reason, a time and material contract is best used for work valued at small dollar amount and lasting a short amount of time. To make sure that the costs do not become higher than budgeted, the buyer may add a not to exceed clause. With this clause, the buyer has a relatively less cost risk as compared to cost reimbursable and fixed price contracts. In a project, there can be multiple procurements run in parallel with the different vendors. Each one will have its own life cycle. So, the procurement manager needs to select the right contract type for each procurement in the project based on the completeness of the statement of work and the final product, what is being purchased, the product or a service, effort and expertise needed to manage the seller, seller incentive, and the marketplace or economy. This brings to the end of our view. I know it was overwhelming because of so many contract types. I would strongly to go through the session once again if it's needed, even as many times as needed until you understand all the contract types fully. It's very important to understand these fundamentals because all the discussion that will follow are based on these concepts. In fact, many PMP aspirants find the procurement knowledge area is very difficult just because of the contract types. Even in the sample examination, there will be tricky questions. So do not move to the next discussion until you understand what is discussed in this session. If you fully understood what we discussed in this session, then let's move to the IDTOs.